MademmyifyASMR True Crime. Welcome back, my Mad Hatters, and welcome to Mademmyify ASMR, and of course welcome to another True Crime Tuesday. Today's True Crime is part 2 of the Osyth witches trial. This one is actually going to be a shorter one than last week's, and I will include a link to part 1 in the description, just because it will make more sense if you watch part 1 before part 2, obviously. But yeah, I started writing the remainder of it and I was like, oh, there was a lot less left than I expected. But yeah, like the last one was getting really long, so I felt I just needed to cut it a bit short. But this one is going to be a shorter part 2, and then next week's True Crime is going to be a pretty awful one. So we've had a couple of nice weeks before a very awful True Crime coming up next week. Anyway, I'm going to dive straight into things and go straight into part 2 of the St. Osyth's witches trial. Oh, if you remember, quick recap, if you remember from part 1, TLDR version was Ursula Kemp, who was known as Grey locally, was accused of being a witch by a woman named Grace Thurlow, and the accusations, as they always do in witch trials, escalated from there. Over the rest of February and throughout March, Justice Brian Darcy collected more information from the residents of St. Osyth, each round of questioning bringing forward more names of witches and further evidence against those that had already been accused of witchcraft. Alice Hunt's daughter and Ursula Kemp's son came forward to speak out against their parents, and they confirmed details that others had said about them. New accusations were made against Henry, and I think it's pronounced Cicely Sellis. Cicely Sellis is a really hard one to say when you have a lisp. It was implied that a fire at a barn had been their doing, using witchcraft. Cicely was also accused of causing the death of a child belonging to a guy named Thomas Death, which is a really gothy surname. Originally, Cicely had been the child's wet nurse, but after Thomas Death and his wife had stopped using her as a wet nurse, she apparently cursed them, telling Thomas's wife, "Thou shalt lose more by having it than thou shalt have for the keeping of it." Then, a month later, this child went out into the yard to play and just dropped down dead. After this incident with the child, Thomas Death also noticed his pigs were behaving oddly. They apparently leapt around the yard and then suddenly just died. He also had a fat cow that passed away very suddenly, clearly because some spell was put on it. There was also a statement taken from the Sellis' son, who was just 9 at the time. He told Justice Darcy that one night at around midnight he had laid in bed and he had seen a spirit go over to his brother John and grab his leg. This spirit looked like his sister, and John cried out for his father, saying, "Father, come help me. There is a black thing that hath me by the leg, as big as my sister." His father had then said to his mother, "Why, thou whore, cannot keep your imps from my children?" And Cicely had told the spirits to come away from the boy, and it stopped after that. John Sellis was also questioned. He was only 6 years old, and he basically told the same story that his brother had. It was also around March time when these accusations began spilling out of St. Osyth's, and Alice Manfield from the nearby village of Thorpe was accused by a local constable of causing a cart to become stuck in the ground following a disagreement. Alice actually confessed to having 4 spirits named Robin, William, Jack and Puppet. I think she shared these spirits. It seemed quite common in this case for the spirits to be shared with a woman named Margaret Greville, as which is an odd one. She'd also sent spirits to Cheston's wife following his death to plague her animals some more after she'd refused to give her some curds. I'd put the totally wrong word in my notes there, sorry. In early March, Ursula was actually transferred from St. Osyth's to the Colchester Castle, along with eventually several others who were accused at St. Osyth's. Following this transfer, Ursula now realised maybe that protection that Darcy had offered her wasn't going to be as sure as a thing as she had perhaps hoped in the beginning. Because of this, or in spite of this, Ursula continued to name witches to anyone who would listen. She was questioned again on March the 9th about one of the stories she had told several people, as she told several people that she believed Alice Newman had sent a spirit to torment the late Lord Darcy, who was actually related to Brian Darcy, until he died, and she confirmed that, yeah, I was told about this by Tiffin. It's unknown how many people came to visit Ursula and the other witches at Colchester. I think the visitor's book just had them listed as witches, or you didn't have to say who you were specifically visiting, but one who came forward to speak to Darcy after his visit was a man named Henry Durant, a butcher from St. Osyth's. He told the justice he had visited Colchester with several people from the town, and he had asked Ursula about his daughter's death. Ursula told him that his daughter had been killed by Alice Hunt, and Mother Barnes had bewitched her after he had refused to give the two women a piece of pork that they asked for, because I think it was already dressed and he'd have to cut it up or something to give them this specific piece, so he just said no. One of the last people to give evidence was Ursula's own brother, Lawrence Kemp. He told Darcy his wife had had trouble in her back and in her privy parts, and had been ill for around 9 months before eventually dying. During the course of this illness, his wife had insisted that Ursula was the cause, and that Ursula had forsaken her. The two women had this long-standing feud for whatever reason. 2 years before her death, the two women had actually met on Elliot's Heath, and Ursula had, seemingly for no reason, just begun beating her sister-in-law, even pulling up her skirt and beating her on the hips and kicking her legs. Ursula had also been present at her sister-in-law's deathbed. This was seen as a further indication of her witchiness, as she had arrived without being sent for, and until this point her sister-in-law had been fading, but she was still breathing, still hanging on. But after Ursula had arrived, she had taken her by the arm, and her sister-in-law had gasped one last time and then died. On March 29th, 1582, Ursula Kemp, Alice Newman, Alice Hunt, Elizabeth Bennet, Cicely Sellis, Alice Mansfield, Margaret Greville, Agnes Glasscock, Agnes Hurd, and several others were tried for witchcraft at the Chelmsford Assizes. Ursula and Alice Newman were indicted for murder by witchcraft, having apparently caused the death of Elizabeth Leverdale, Edna Stratton, and Joan Thurlow by bewitching them. Alice Newman was remanded in custody. Ursula, in spite of this promise of leniency by Justice Darcy and giving him the witch trial that would ultimately help him become Sheriff of Essex, was found guilty and she was sentenced to hang. Elizabeth Bennet was found guilty of bewitching Joan and William Biet and causing their deaths. She was also sentenced to hang alongside Ursula. Alice Hunt was found not guilty of murder in the case of Henry Durant's daughter, and not guilty of bewitching William Hayward's cattle, but was remanded in custody. Agnes Glasscock was found guilty of murder by witchcraft, but was also just remanded. Joan Pesci Professor Newman, there are no records of their deaths, but their absence from records after 1588 implies that they probably died that year, and there were no records of them ever living anywhere else. Ursula Kemp, known as Grey, was very much the central figure in the St. Osyth's witch trial. As I mentioned in part 1, she was known for her ability to unwitch people and cure them rather than put bewitchments onto people. The way the town eventually turned on her shows the precarious role held by those that could apparently, I say apparently because we know that most of the time these cures did nothing, it was just all old wives' tale, that could apparently cure others using magic. There is some conflict around this role, as she served as a birth attendant, and historically midwives were usually not accused of witchcraft, as they were actually really highly valued in the community. The only known accusation of a midwife was at the Newcastle witches trial, which I have also covered on this channel. So this casts out that Ursula was considered to be a midwife, as she was likely just someone who attended to pregnant women. The use of child witnesses is also quite striking in this case. These children were as young as 6, and they likely didn't realise the impact of what they were saying. They were just children. Ursula's son was just 8 when he spoke out against his mother, seemingly to confirm what she had said. Sexual immorality is also a really important part of the St. Osyth's narrative. Ursula was partly seen as naughty due to having an illegitimate son, and Joan Pesci had been accused of incest, as apparently her 23-year-old son had lain naked in bed with her, which, yeah, seems a little odd, but, well, very odd, but both denied that anything happened. Elizabeth Bennet, one of the accused, was, now this one is an odd one because some people have taken it that she was in a lesbian relationship, but some people are like, they were just very close friends. William Bonner referred to Elizabeth Bennet as his wife's lover, and he was questioned by Brian Darcy in February, and he actually showed some resentment and claimed that Elizabeth Bennet had caused a lameness in his wife's knee, and when she had tried to cure this, she had caused her lips to swell and her eyes to sink into her head. Today, there are actually still reminders in St. Osyth's of these trials. The Cage, which was a medieval prison where Ursula was kept before being moved to Colchester Castle, actually has a plaque that mentions her. The house, which is where the Cage was, is actually said to be one of the most haunted in England, but I'm sure there's like several houses, places in England that all claim to be the most haunted. It's like the Golden Fleece in York, where it's like the most haunted pub. Yeah, loads of people make that claim. In 1921, 2 skeletons were actually found in a garden in St. Osyth's, and it was believed that these might be the bodies of Ursula and of Elizabeth Bennet. However, a study of the bones in the late noughties proved that they were likely Roman in origin, like the remains of witches. It's never actually, it was never recorded where they were buried after the trials or anything, because they were seen as ungodly, so they would never have Christian burial, and they would just be dumped somewhere in a hole, essentially. So there's no actual record of where either of them were buried, but their bodies have never been officially found, and the skeletons, it's never been confirmed it was them. Anyway, that's all I have for you on the St. Osyth's witch trial. I really hope that you've enjoyed this case. I love doing witch trials. I don't know he's really into like witch trials and stuff, and he was saying we're both agreeing like a lot of the medieval torture methods. I think I mentioned this in my Newcastle Witches Trial True Crime. Like a lot of the torture methods and a lot of the accusations, it was basically all to stop outspoken women. So, you know, in today's society, I would probably be tried as a witch. Anyway, I hope I've educated and informed you.